quite the shine on these glasses, isn't it? These blue blockers, they're supposed to help your eyes. I don't know, kind of just make everything brown. Right, so here we are, chapter 2, moving on from that first chapter about the development of Western Hemisphere civilizations. We'll review those quickly, but then getting into really the age of exploration, the age of discovery, and the beginnings of colonization. Yes, of Central America, but also more important to us in this class is North America, the American continent. I don't have any tech time, because I think what I want to do is do this Blackboard one more time, which will be next Thursday. Time stamping here. I'm doing this on the 9th, Saturday, so let's see. The 14th. On the 14th, we'll go through, if you have questions on Blackboard, hopefully at that point, all of the churn on getting you guys your login information, everything working will be done, but certainly any questions you have, it'll be better to do them in person. Video 1, I tried to step through some of that. Here's a college success tip, and I said I was going to put these in as we go, some ideas on things. One of the things I see new college students do is they feel like everything's equally important, thus I must memorize everything. And pretty soon your head will just explode if you do this. So what to review? Think about where the focus is. Those glossary words, again, those are in the additional materials folder. The words of the day that I use kind of set the stage for the entire class. So those are key ideas or key concepts, and I may have a concept of the day. Those are both high up on the list of what to study, what to review. And even though it's with videos, it might not be a bad idea to take a few notes. The idea of note taking, one, it kind of helps cement it in your brain, and it's going through a different avenue as opposed to watching the video, listening to me yap, and you write down some key ideas. And when it comes time to prep for the quiz, looking through the slides, man, that's a lot if you're going to do that for every quiz. And then midterm and final gets even worse. But if I have a few notes and just look through those words of the day, some of the key ideas in the slides, I can make a really good quiz review in probably 30, 45 minutes. Right? The stuff we hit at the beginning of each class, going back to the last, it's probably part of the reason to review those is they're important to keep things connected. Thus, they're important informational bits. And so your notes. So when it was, when I was in school, I would take notes, and unfortunately without a book, that's one of the things I liked about a book, was I would take notes on the side in areas that I thought were important. But in this case, jot some notes down and going over key ideas, the glossary, words of the day, and a page or two of notes, and you'll be well prepared for each quiz. So it's about the concepts. It's not about small, minute details. Again, we're trying to tell a story here. That's what history is, about how we got here. Right? So memorizing, and I said it in the intro, I don't do memorizing dates. There's some that just stick with us, right? December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. Or June 6th, 1944, the invasion of Normandy, trying to get into Europe to take down Hitler. But I don't know that any of the quizzes I've ever given have a date that you have to pick which day this happened on. It's about the events, right? So, as I said, review those 3 Mesoamerican civilizations. We started with the Olmecs, small, right? Pre-birth of Christ, about 200 BC is when they started dissolving. And those groups, they were all in that Yucatan Peninsula area. We see the rise and then the fall of the Mayan Empire, and then the rise and fall of the Aztec Empire. And we're going to talk about the fall piece in this class, because we really looked at the rise, but it seemed like they were doing quite well, right? The cities, the floating gardens, the structure, the civilization. But if you remember, there was the Montezuma on edge, right? The comet, that something bad's coming. Something's a guy named Cortez, but we'll get to that. Reasons for decline and dissolution. Why do cultures, why do societies come apart? There's a lot of reasons behind that. Bad leadership could be one of them, but we looked a little bit at that kind of cultural dead end idea. Too much warring, too much sacrificing, a loss of focus of the people. So there's a bunch of things, and often those are combined together to result in the dissolution of. But you saw too that as one fell, it wasn't immediate, but another one would rise to kind of fill that vacuum. If you watched the video, I hope you did. The first of the Robin Hood videos where he's being threatened. The French are coming across the channel. He's got his lords and barons up in arms, and he says, I can do better than that. I can do better than just promise you something. I can put it down in writing. And again, it's Hollywood-ish, but it's the idea of the Magna Carta, a great charter. And why did he do it? Because he needed the help of the lords and barons to defeat the French. So he had his back against the wall. And in reality, the king, King John, was in the same boat in the actual, if you watch the actual Magna Carta history video, is that as his power was threatened, he'd throw a crumb at the lords, the barons. We think of it as the peasants. They were kind of so low on the chain, it didn't really affect them immediately. But each time that would happen, each of those monarchs would give a little piece of power, as small as possible, to kind of placate the masses for a short time. And what's not on the video, he says, I swear on my mother's life it will be done. And so they believe him. And then, of course, the last video was him burning the Magna Carta in front of him, saying, look, divine right of kings, I did it for my own reasons. Now that deal is off. Okay? Why did he agree? Because he needed them to fight for him. And he needed to stay in power. And better to give away a small piece and stay in power than to fight and potentially lose it all. Right? Which, at that point, maybe not going to happen. But as we move through time, we get to King George and the American Revolution. There's a slow dissolving of the divine right of kings, yes, but the overall power of the monarchy. To the point now, today, look, the Brits living in England, it was funny, there was kind of a split. About half of them loved the royal family. They liked hanging on to that traditional piece, and about half of them thought it was a big waste of money. And the Queen, yes, still has power, but not nearly what the monarchs of old had. Much more of a figurehead or symbolic. And so that's why he agreed. It was in his own best interest to do that. Now we ended with this picture. I call it propaganda because it is. Right? Happy natives welcoming Columbus. Look how giant he is. Here I am to save the day. Right? If you notice, look in the back. A religious person, right? A priest of some fashion. So here we are, Columbus. This kind of kicks us into this age of discovery. So we're going to look at a couple groups, some of what was going on in Europe. And again, these are a little bit tangential, but to expand your knowledge of stuff. So Portugal starts and kind of leads the way. But they don't keep the lead for very long because Spain's hot on their heels. And then Spain loses the lead, right, to the English. And that's going to bring us up to the cusp of really colonizing North America, primarily by the English. The French are in there as well, and we'll talk more about it. But England finally gains kind of the lead in the imperial world of gaining new territory. Okay? And then the last, that Columbian exchange is important, the exchange of goods between the new and old world, and what that does to both sides. Word of the day, Blue Star video, another ridiculous Monty Python. If you didn't like the first ones, you probably won't like any of them, so you can skip them. And this one I would only watch the first minute and a half, but it's about the Spanish Inquisition. And what that was the Catholic Church using torture, using whatever means necessary to maintain the power of the Catholic Church in Spain. And if you remember from the previous class, for a while Spain was under that Islamic kind of an invasion, right? The expanding of Islam throughout North Africa, certainly the Middle East, and all the way into Spain and Portugal. And so the violence used to maintain power by the Catholic Church, it was the Spanish Inquisition. It's pretty grim. Monty Python makes fun of it. And then the word orthodoxy in there, it's only fair to define that. um, norms, right? And religion is full of norms. So is our culture. And that's one of the things people have griped about, or maybe liked about, soon to be former President Trump, was he broke norms. And sometimes that's a good thing because norms can become a rut, but sometimes they're there for a reason, and it's part of the overall culture or the religious doctrine, right? And so that's what we're talking about. A privateer, it's a strange word. It's not quite a pirate, but you can sort of think of it that way, right? You know, a pirate seizing ships, taking things. The difference with a privateer, a pirate is working for themselves, right? Working for the captain of the ship, Blackbeard. A privateer is working for a government, and they're authorized to attack, capture, steal from ships under another government's flag. And we're going to see that, especially English queens condoning English ships attacking Spanish ships, Spanish galleons, to get the goods off of them, the gold and silver primarily. Okay? And it's called the prize, whatever the ship contains. If you, as a pirate or privateer, take a ship, you get everything on it, right? Some of that's going to go to the government, but in this agreement, as a privateer, you're going to get to keep a big chunk of it. So there's a monetary incentive because it's dangerous work. If you haven't seen it, the movie Master and Commander demonstrates naval warfare. It's a little later than what we're talking about, the early 1800s Napoleonic time, but it really shows how dangerous being a naval officer or a privateer could be. All right, mercantilism, right? We think of our economic system today as capitalism. Build a company, invent the greatest mousetrap ever, build it, sell it. Okay. Back then, it was mercantilism was the style, the economy. So what that principle says is nations should control trades. In fact, if you jump ahead, it says they're colonies. So that means nations have to have colonies, right? And we're going to get to the American colonies, of course. I have those colonies. One, they're hard to control because they're far away often. They're expensive, but the benefit outweighs those downsides. And what's the benefit? The benefit has to do with trade. It has to do with resources. So the English want the American colonies because they get stuff from America that they need. And this favorable balance of trade, it means they're getting more out of the colonies than they're paying for or dealing with frustrations and trying to govern them. That balance of trade. More coming to the mother country, and you'll hear me say the crown a lot. When I say the crown, that means the monarchy of whatever country, and most specifically England. So the crown is benefiting much more than it's costing them to run the early American colonies. Now that balance of trade and the pain in the butt level goes up to the point that we reach a revolution. Okay? And honestly, the revolution is won because they're tired of dealing with us, is part of it. Excuse me. And the last, all isms are bad, right? Ferris Bueller said that, all isms are bad. But to do this, if I have to have colonies to be a mercantilistic power, then that means I need colonies. And imperialism is how we make that happen. That you're extending your power, your authority over other nations. And during this time frame, there's a battle because there's so much riches available. Remember, Portugal, then Spain, and then we'll see France and England, other two powerhouses in Europe, really come to the fore. So they're all kind of fighting for control over really most of the rest of, let's call it the Western Hemisphere at this point. And I've got a couple maps that explain how crazy this can get. All right, so the foot stomper. Portugal leads the way. Portugal starts the age of exploration. Why are they doing this? Go back to the Silk Road. It was dangerous, long, expensive. Half the stuff didn't get there. Paid taxes to middlemen. So if I can figure out a way to stay on my flagged vessels, my ships, sail to where the goods are, and then bring them back, I can avoid that. More profit, more benefit. Portugal kicks it off, and you'll see this better on a map that shows where they're going, which also kind of lends itself back to that review of the slave trade, where the Portuguese, how they get to India and Asia. So here we go, starting off, Henry the Navigator. What they do is they kind of slowly eke their way down the coast of Africa. And by doing this, it did a couple things. One, you find your way getting around the Cape of Good Hope finally and on toward India. But by doing this, you expand science, geography, cartography, map making, better shipbuilding, better methods of propulsion. Let's call it that. And at this time, it's the sail. But we're going to go off on a little bit of a creative tangent on that one in a little bit. And the Caravel was the name of a ship. Okay, and so another one, Cape of Good Hope, the tail end of the bottom piece of Africa and getting around the Horn. You guys are probably familiar with some of these names back from even grade school history. But the idea is more not so much about their names and individuals, but what they were doing, expanding this route. Okay, and here's kind of it's not an odd one, but if you notice, the Portuguese are focused really on the coast of Africa, and you get this one kind of shot across the Atlantic, and that's why even today Brazil's language is Portuguese, because they were founded, if you will, by the Portuguese. Okay, so what's compelling them? I already said that. The Silk Road, the cost, the taxation, the danger, the loss of materials that they're trying to get back to Mother Europe. So here, it's not the greatest map, but it's okay. And you can see, right, Portugal is the face of this Iberian Peninsula. And so this movement down, down, and around. And remember, this becomes the slave coast right here, to the point of Cape of Good Hope and around. And now I'm up and into the Indian Ocean and on my way to India and Asia. And here's that Brazil piece. So that's why we say the Portuguese kick off the age of exploration. And this map gives a little bit better definition. The dark blue is the Portuguese, and you can see it's a coastal phenomenon in and around Africa. So they were bebopping their way down the coast, but they weren't really going deep inland into Africa. And eventually around the coast, India, Indonesia, up in Thailand, Vietnam, that area. Whereas the Spanish, obviously there's Spain, the home country, you've got more of a focus on Meso and South America, and there are Spanish explorers in and about, even in the northern part of North America. But that's more toward the French and a little bit to the British at this point. No real Portuguese. There are some explorers, yes, but no real Portuguese settlements or presence in North America as compared to the Spanish. You can see up into almost into the Great Salt Lake area. Right. I put this in there. See, there's this one little gap. If you notice, there's nothing there. Nobody wants it. This area called Guinea, and it's so jungle-like and infested with nasty little critters that nobody really wants to settle it because it seems like useless. And eventually it becomes a penal colony for a while. That's how grim it is. Anyhow, more of Europe looking westward. Right? They're not immune to seeing the Portuguese and then the Spanish, especially, extracting massive wealth from the Western Hemisphere. Strong monarchies, each want power, right? And so to do that, I want to get to be part of this game of imperialism and mercantilism. So the Spanish soon take charge. You can see the Portuguese focused over in this direction, but the Spanish in this unexplored Western Hemisphere find riches beyond their dreams, right? El Dorado, the city of gold. And so we see kind of the beginnings of, even though it's not truly the beginning of the age of exploration, but the age of coming across, seeking that sail west to get east. And yes, there's the fear of, if I go too far, I sail off the edge, but I think that's overblown. I mean, the Arabs had figured out the circumference of the world thousands of years ago, and they were pretty accurate about it. So there was plenty of people who understood that the world was a globe, not a flat plate. There's still a few that don't get that, right? But Columbus, who was he? Well, he was an Italian. He tried to get sponsorship from whom? Who was the first ones? Who am I going to go to who's leading the age of discovery? Well, Portugal, right? But he can't, so he gets sponsorship from Spain. And then he's looking for, yes, the pathway west to get east, the path to the another way to get the riches instead of going by the Silk Road. But a lot of Columbus, what he was looking for was fame and fortune for Spain, but for himself as well. So fill in the blank a little bit. Did I get it right? Italian, Portuguese, Spanish. Kind of makes sense if you know the flow of who was in the lead and then the Spanish catching up and taking over. Right? So there's Columbus. And here's kind of a list of the various routes. And again, not to try to get all of them, but if you look at the different colorations, you can see the Spanish in red and where their focus was. Right? Up in, New Mexico, what we know today as New Mexico, Texas, in that area, certainly Central America, in and around Florida. But if you look at the French, the green, more focused on the interior, in and around the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. And if you look at the British, the English, the blue, they're really not all that prominent on the map right now. So they're a little bit late to the game. So just looking at this in the colors, you would say the Spanish are in the lead, and in fact they are, right? And I put this blue arrow here, this treaty, this line, and I've got a better map to show what it means, what it does. But you can see it comes really between a line through the Atlantic Ocean, and it's dividing something. That's why it's there. So this treaty, Tordesillas, it's not so much the treaty, the name of, but the arrogance involved. This inter cetera that goes with it, that comes from the Pope. And the Pope, remember how powerful the Catholic Church is in Europe, and the Pope says, you know what, any part of the world that's not in possession of a Christian ruler, we're going to divide it equally between Portugal and Spain. What arrogance, right? That everybody else is so, not subhuman, but, they're savages because we know best. And so that's what that line was all about. It was to try to keep those two really from going to war with each other, fighting over it. So it divides the globe between Portugal and Spain. And you can see Spain on this side has a treasure trove of riches waiting for it. And that powers the Spanish to the lead, right, in the age of discovery and in just raw power, military power. Yeah, you guys know the story here, right? Heading away. Portugal said no, so he went to Spain. They said yes. He sails across, believes he's in the East Indies, hence the name Indians. I guess he thought Cuba was China. I don't know. And he made more than one voyage. In fact, he made 4. But he never quite cottoned on to the idea that he'd hit a new landmass. So it took longer to discover more areas beyond what Columbus hit and to finally figure out that this area is highly valuable. And one of the most valuable areas was the area where the Aztecs were. Right? That civilization had been around for a while. Little trivia, if you didn't know, America is named for Amerigo Vespucci. You would think it would have been named Colombia. So why an Italian sailor working and claiming areas for Spain? Because he's getting paid to do it, right? And some other Spanish, though, the reasons for folks coming over, you've got these conquistadores hidalgos, right? Spanish names. They're nobles, but they're not really high up on the noble pecking order. So they come here, and it begs the question then, why would they leave, even if it's minor nobility, why would you leave that kind of cushy job back in Spain to come to the New World where many threats await you? Well, what do you think? What would be a benefit? Riches, fame and fortune, right? A large share of the golden wealth, plus they're granted farms, land grants, and with those they can demand the natives become basically slaves to them. So you've got wealth both in the form of gold and silver and wealth in the form of land, becoming kind of a land baron. So that was enough of a draw to get more of them to come over. And of course, there's always, when we're talking about imperialism, there's a certain nationalistic bent to it. These countries are fighting for who's going to be top dog. And at this point, Spain is becoming top dog in the world of European imperial power. And then there's this piece, the idea of spreading Christianity. Sound familiar? Well, it sounds a little bit like the Crusades, but remember the Crusades, there was a kind of a darker or simpler motivation. They were afraid of the expanding Islamic empire, tried to beat that back. But that, I mean, still today, right? There's people, the idea in Christianity of proselytizing to bring people to the Word of God. So it, still goes on today. There he is. Cortez comes into Mexico. You're going to kind of see a little ebb and flow to how he does in this area. When he lands, Aztecs are the most powerful group. And so he forms alliances with the enemies, although they're native cultures, but they're enemies of the Aztecs. Okay, and those are some of the names. Some of them are almost impossible. They have horses, war dogs, firearms. They have a firepower advantage. They don't really have a manpower advantage, but the alliances with other tribes helps. And this starts an idea, and we're going to see this throughout our course in history, is the idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And sometimes that works in the short term. Sometimes it backfires. The enemy of my enemy was, in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, who became the Taliban. Why did we side with them? Because we were against the Russians when they invaded Afghanistan in 1979. So yeah, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but that sort of backfired on us, didn't it? This idea that, look at these pale faces, that somehow Cortez is a god. And you saw, and that's why I used the propaganda picture of Columbus, how, although it's elaborative, that the way they dress, things like that, that you can see why they might be misinterpreted, maybe not as the god, but remember these cultures worship a pantheon of gods. It's not monotheism. And so Cortez, yes, you're going to pay us gold, and why wouldn't you? Because I'm a god. And at some point, enough is enough, and the Aztecs rebel. And so we see the kind of the ebb of Cortez as they flee with some of the gold, but they come back with a vengeance. Right? Another year later, regroup, defeat the Aztecs, and now Cortez is in control of that empire. And you saw how big, even just the main city that becomes Mexico City is. And so they're extracting a lot of wealth from this area. Oops. It's not just the fighting that decimates the native tribes. One of the biggest things was Europeans brought over diseases that had never been in the Western Hemisphere. So there's no natural resistance to it, a la COVID-19, right? This new strain that we don't have anything built up for. And so you see, this was just one example in Santo Domingo, the destruction, the decimation of the population by European diseases. And believe it or not, that is part of what we're going to talk about, the Columbian Exchange, the exchange of diseases from the new to old and old to new world. It was certainly more from the old world to the new world, but there was one the natives gave back to the Europeans, just to keep them in line, I guess. And again, this is more like elementary geography, but the idea is of discovering the Pacific. Like, it wasn't there till this guy found it. Of course, Magellan, probably one of the most famous, the circumnavigation of, and that gets to how in the world do you sail around the world in these little rickety ships that they have? It was a harsh existence. So I remember I said I wasn't really going to talk about the Incans down in South America, just a little FYI. And now we see some exploration in southeastern U.S., in and around the Mississippi River. Okay? Coronado out west. Here's the foot stomper. None of these, you're never going to have, what did Balboa discover? Right? But the big thing here is how much money, how much wealth is being extracted. 12 million, that's real money back then by 1600. So Spain has a lot of cash, right? A lot of wealth, let's put it that way. And so what can you do with that? Well, you can do domestic building. If you're queen or king and you're bringing in all this wealth, you're pretty popular. But you can also try to build the best military to get more and hang on to more power. And so that's what the Spanish do. Now they do some other things as well. Now I didn't mention this. I'll talk about it with the classroom folks. But for you guys, this is an acronym. And if I don't, remind me to explain it. But DIME is an acronym for Arms of National Power. How countries make things happen in the world. Here, Spain's making things happen in the world. And there's ways to do it. D is diplomacy. In this case, they don't really care about diplomacy, the idea of talking back and forth. They'll just kill the Aztecs. I is information, more important today perhaps, but still propaganda if you think of it that way. M is the military. And then E is economic. And so what happens with Spain pulling all this money out, they have economic wealth, they have economic power, and they use that to increase their military power. Think naval fleets, right? Because that's the keys to the kingdom, the coin of the realm back then. Yeah, just a quick, where some of the folks explored different areas of what's going to become America. Ponce de Leon looking for the Fountain of Youth. De Soto in and around the Mississippi River, the interior of Coronado out west. Okay, just a little graphic. Picture's worth 1,000 words. Remember, we talked about kind of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the area between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, which means rebirth. So you see the Renaissance in and around that time frame, and look, that's right in there where the Age of Discovery kicks in. So the kind of birth of the modern world. Not quite yet to the Enlightenment, which we'll talk about later, but at least the idea of learning and inquiry and not believing in hocus pocus and the boogeyman. So that science and explaining why things happen as opposed to the gods being angry about it. So European culture is changing. What makes nations grow population-wise? Because all of these things come from that. I don't have trade, towns, corporations unless I have more and more people. And what fuels that? Beyond reproduction, yes, I get it, is food. If you can't feed a population, it's going to naturally limit how big it can get because people are going to start starving. Remember the idea of the hunter-gatherer, that I can only do so much because the land can only produce so much until I get structured agriculture. And so you see as the food supply increases, and there's a why behind that, the growth in the population and the decline in the lord and the castle with the peasants working the land, that plantation style sharecropping agriculture. And so these countries, nation state's kind of a funny word, just think of countries. These nations, these countries are getting bigger and more powerful. Okay. Imperialism's a good way to measure it. How much of the rest of the world do I, Mother England or Mother Spain, own? And why do I do that? It's because I can extract resources from my colonies. So yes, imperialism on the rise. And here it is. The answer to the food piece. How do I feed all these folks? Yeah, maybe I don't feed them horses. But the exchange of from the old world to the new. And you can see what was brought over. Sugarcane was a big one. Right? That becomes a huge cash crop. Citrus, wheat, barley. Some of these strike me as odd. I never thought about which way they came across the ocean. Food's back to the old world. Maize, the native word for corn, was a lot that wasn't in Europe at the time. And the one that really struck me was potatoes. I always had in my mind potatoes were kind of an Irish phenomenon, right? The Great Potato Famine. But they actually came from the old world back to the new world. Oh yeah, and they brought back tobacco, and I want you to keep that one in mind. It's not something that makes a nice healthy breakfast, but it's a cash crop, and it becomes super important as we get into the colonization of North America. Okay, so this new world, these foods that grow well in the old world really transform the diet of the old world. So that answers our riddle. Is that population, the growth of towns, because because they can be fed, right? And it increases. And you know what? It increases too much for some people. And now you have bums, right? These kind of Dickensian, if you think of Charles Dickens characters. But you have these kind of scrubby, grubby folks in the bigger cities of Europe, and the more wealthy folks want to get them the heck out of there. Hold that thought as well. And here's your disease piece, right? I said most from the old to the new, but look, just for your trip over here, the natives gave the Europeans VD. Kind of funny. Man, wouldn't believe talking really dries you out. More of a graphic depiction. And I throw this up and have people pick out, do any of these surprise you? Again, I said I thought the potato piece was a surprise going to Europe. I thought it would have come the other way. But you can see the back and forth. That is foot stomp, the Columbian Exchange. Food, livestock, plants, diseases. Back and forth. One of those being tobacco. And this comes out of the textbook. It's kind of a bizarre picture. But here's where I want to get into the time machine for a minute. And I'm going to go a little bit quick to keep this under an hour. But the idea of commodification, where I'm making something, a crop, to commodify, to make money. Okay? Sugarcane was one, but at least I can use that to make food or make it tasty or whatever. Tobacco, not so much. But tobacco has an interesting sidebar to it. It's addictive, okay? And it becomes the next cash crop. The book talks about it with almost no context. So that's why I say get into the time machine, right? The Back to the Future machine. So bear with me. I'm going to go a little bit quick, but we're going to step through religion. And this is going to tie to, as we get to people like the Puritans and the Pilgrims, part of the why it motivated them to take this harrowing journey across the Atlantic in rickety old boats. So you have the beginning of what's called the Reformation. Remember, from the first class we talked about, Europe was primarily under the control of the Catholic Church. You had the small inroads of Islam up and into the Iberian Peninsula with Portugal and Spain, but there are some chinks in the papal armor as well. One of the biggest ones is this idea of the Reformation. And so the split that, you know what, the Pope and the Catholic Church, this is kind of ridiculous that the Pope controls getting in and out of heaven, and he can grant you clemency if you do something wrong. Or he can promise you, crusaders, you, the Knights of the Crusade, that if you kill in the name of Christianity, it's good. In fact, it's a benefit to you. And so he disagrees. He and John Calvin, Calvinism, right, comes from it, as in the Lutheran Church as well. And he posts these theses on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. We don't care about that, but what it says is, I'm paraphrasing, but Pope, you're exaggerating your power. Okay, so yeah, you meet on Friday, no problem, pay the Catholic Church, you get a papal indulgence, you're off the hook, it's all good. He said, that's nonsense. Okay, he insists the Pope has no power. People don't like it when you attack their power, especially considering the power the Pope had. Right? You can't sell indulgences. You can't get people off the hook. None of this comes from the Bible. This is all self-perpetuating garbage. So he says this is the only way to salvation. And that's more in line with modern Christianity in the United States, right? The way to salvation through Jesus, the Word of God. This doesn't sit really well because it erodes power. So a direct challenge to the Pope. And this is the best map I can find. Unfortunately, it's not in English, but that doesn't really matter. We can figure it out. So you have the rise of the Protestants after the Reformation. Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans. Who the heck are they? We'll come back to that one. Of course, you still have a huge amount of power with the Catholic Church and these orthodoxies, otherwise known as Islam. Okay? The Anglicans. The Anglican Church. Who are they? Where did they come from? Well, first you got to understand Anglia is the Latin term for England. Okay? So Anglican Church is the English church, the Church of England. Still exists today. Where did it come from? It didn't have anything to do with the Reformation per se. It had to do with a guy named Henry VIII. We'll come back to it. So with that division, let's go back just quickly. Now I've got competition both between countries, but also between religions. And that helps fuel this age of exploration and the idea of dime, right? Getting more economic and maybe military power to extend my influence around the world. So it helps divide Europe. You have competition not only between Spain and Portugal and England, but between Catholics and Protestant nations. And that friction kind of drives the follow-on events, not directly, but indirectly. So stay with me here. Yeah, we're going to see England and France move to the stage. They see all this wealth coming in, and they can't just sit on the sidelines. And we'll say this, Spain does have a monopoly. It was called the Siglo d'Oro, the century of gold. And that was the 1500s. But as we get into the 1600s, they're going to see their power slipping away. And part of it's from bad financial planning. Part of it's from military defeat. There he is. I watched something on Henry VIII not that long ago that in his youth he was very fit, and I think he fell off a horse, hurt his leg, so he was almost immobilized, and that's why he got so fat. And the 6 wives of Henry VIII. I'm not going to go into gory detail. You can read about them on the next slide. But he has a problem. He can't have an heir, a son, with Catherine of Aragon. And according to the Catholic Church, divorce is a no-no, right? And then throw into the mix, Anne Boleyn gets pregnant. What? Gasp. So let's step through that. Again, what does this have to do with American? Well, it does, actually. Right, so annulled, right? Male heir, Catholicism, no divorce. You can't do that. Soon-to-be second wife pregnant. Oh, my goodness. Sounds like the Housewives of Atlanta or something, right? How salacious can you get? So he decides, you know what? Instead of fighting with the Catholic Church, I'm going to start my own religion. The C of E, right? Church of England, no problem. Next wife, no problem. And so I just put this, if you're interested, kind of the sequence of the 6 wives of Henry VIII. None of them did too well, except Catherine Parr. She outlived him. So they were either annulled, died in childbirth, or beheaded. Nice guy. And you can see maybe because of this, the beginnings of Protestant, puritanical pilgrims, just as a group, that they're not keen on this. So they want to get out. They want religious purity. Okay? So isn't that what partly drives them across the Atlantic Ocean? They hated the Church of England. Okay? And look at this. When I move my head. Where does that come from? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Freedom of religion, as we call it, which is sort of a misnomer, will not establish nor prohibit is what it really says, but it's part of what? First Amendment, right? Bill of Rights. Where does it come from? You see the beginnings of it here. You can worship what you want. We're not going to restrict it. Because, look, a lot of what goes into our Constitution in the beginning of our country is in reaction to stuff we saw over in Europe that we didn't like, we being the founders. I tell you what, just sake of time-wise, just gives you a little bit of the throne, the sequence of the throne, Bloody Mary, Elizabeth I. There's some fighting back and forth to reestablish Catholicism in England. But it remains more in the C of E realm. But here's the thing, these sea dogs. We have actual royalty, Queens of England, promoting privateering. So English sailors, go attack those Spanish galleons chalked with gold. They're not British naval vessels. They're privateers. Remember that difference, that they're hired by the crown. but they're really on their own. So they get some of the loot that they pull off of these boats. And eventually Queen Elizabeth just gives up any pretense of friendship with Spain, because she'd been kind of putting off marriage proposals, etc. She says, nah, we're just going full bore. So beyond even privateering, it's just out in the open now that England is trying to take the lead from Spain, right? And here's I'll show you a picture. There she is. Now he's Sir Francis Drake. So what does this say? This says the Crown officially sanctions looting of Spanish ships. Sounds like an act of war to me. We'll come back to that act of war in just a second. The arrival of the English. So we're talking about the arrival here on the North American continent. A pretty famous picture, right, of good old Sir Walter Raleigh. Wrong side. Gilbert up in Canada. And there is a strong English influence in Canada. And then Walter Raleigh down in Virginia, named for Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. 2 rounds. First one failed, he went home. Okay? And it's tough, man, establishing a foothold on a new continent. Comes back a couple years later, it fails again, and this time the colony's lost, right? That lost colony of Roanoke. And they see Croatan scratched on a tree. And it's like, where did these people go? Well, the question to me is, where the heck did Sir Walter Raleigh go? Well, he went back to get resupplies, and due to the war with Spain, he was late coming back. And so by the time he comes back in 1590, the colony is lost. One of those great mysteries. And so the first attempted toehold in North America was a disaster. It is just FYI. If you've ever been out, here's the Outer Banks, this area of North Carolina, right? Kitty Hawks up here where the Wright brothers did their thing. But you can see even some of the names still reflect that time frame. Right. So here again, one that you put up on the board. What are the incentives to colonize? You tell me. Well, think about it for a second. What is going to incentivize any of the countries, but focused on England, to come? It's expensive to voyage across the Atlantic, to establish colonies. You're investing a lot of time, money, resources to get this started. There must be some reason to do it, right? Remember, the population's growing like crazy because of the Columbian Exchange. So land is getting more and more scarce in Mother England. Oops. Mercantilism tells me I need to get more out of the colonies than I put into them. So they must know something, that there's a lot of resources. And in fact, there are. And if I'm going to build a great navy in this time frame, what do I need? I need wood, right? I need trees to build ships. And guess what? The North American continent, you could almost walk across it on the trees because it's virgin wood. So that's an incentive. Religious motivation. We don't like the C of E. We want to be more pure, more puritanical, so we're going to come over. And this overpopulation, to kind of explain it a little bit more, new foods help grow the population, and so with that it grows. But the problem, 2 things happen in England. One, it was called the enclosure movement. For a long time, England was kind of open, free range, but landowners started fencing in more and more of their land. And so what that did was they had kind of squatters living on the land, and now they're forced off of it. And where do they go? They start coagulating in the cities, and that tends to anger those in the cities. Yes, of course, there are French, Dutch in America. The Dutch don't have a long time here. New Amsterdam becomes New York, right? But here's the beginnings of. So in dime, in military, all of that money extracted from the Western Hemisphere helps the Spanish build the Spanish Armada, the greatest fleet in the world at that time, and they attack England. Where'd they get the money? We just said that, right? England does come out victorious. A quick why in just a second. And so with that, they finally knock the Spanish after the Sigla d'Oro, the century of gold. They knock the Spanish off the top rung, and now England has got the upper hand, militarily and imperialistically, in the New World. Right? And so again, we talked about Raleigh. Hopes of easy riches, no such thing. Poor Raleigh, man, he's kind of a dud. He had another attempt in South America. It failed. He ended up getting beheaded. See, he had a rough life. Whoop, sorry. That's the extent of my animation skills. So the Spanish Armada defeat, this is huge. And this helps end their reign at the top. And so just looking at the map, you can read the text. But of 130 ships, just over half of them make it back. This is they sail to destroy, invade, kill, take over England. The first battle is in this area, right? This is Dover, Cologne, right here, Normandy, where we land in World War II. So there's fighting here, but then they decide to sail around the other side and they hit a massive storm on the backside. Scotland, Ireland, and a lot of ships are lost in just the storm itself, and so they limp their way back, defeated now, to Spain. England in the ascendancy. Back to diplomacy. Well, no, there's no real diplomacy with Spain. Remember, they were looting their ships, right? And the Queen was sanctioning it, so that wasn't going well. Informationally, we start to see England thinking, man, we're top dogs. Maybe we're the chosen people. And you see kind of, I would call that the arrogance of the English mentality as they start to deal with natives in what's going to become America. That we are the chosen one. We know best. We are best. Strongest navy, yep, with the defeat of the Armada. And economically, taken from the New World and taken from the Spanish. So once they finally exhaust the Spanish funds, but now they've established colonies, mercantile colonies in the New World. So it's no real surprise. Money and naval power are the keys to imperial power. I get it. Makes sense. Even today, I mean, air power is something, but naval power is key. All right, so some economic facts. Again, we're kind of drawing our path back toward the classic history line, but I hope this makes things make a little more sense. So Spain, we saw the military defeat, but economically, there's other things. They're kind of spending frivolously. Right? They're buying things, but they're not really making things. So it's an extraction process out of the New World, but they're not really doing things on their own to generate funding. So they kind of frivolously spend a lot of their money on merchants, spending on nice things, right? Again, the privateers and pirates pirated by the British, and so their century does end. Said that. The booming population in England, though, adds to social problems. And I mentioned the enclosure movement. The fencing in of land. So these refugees, the wandering refugees, start gathering in the city. And so you saw with Walter Raleigh, Hakluyt, he decides, you know what? This new world, these new slowly developing colonies, that's the perfect safety valve to get rid of this excess. And I highlighted it or italicized it because they're looked down upon. Let's get rid of the riffraff. Let's send them over to the colonies. And a lot of people come over here that way, right? Why was it booming in England again? Yes, one reason I get it, but the food piece, right? The Columbian Exchange is the fuel behind the population boom. So here's your picture of the riffraff, right? And the landed gentry. Get away from my puffy pants. Come on. You guys probably don't know who Jethro Tull is, so never mind. One more idea. All right, and I mentioned the idea of sailing, Sailing 101. I hope you find this interesting. I'll make it fairly quick. But this age of discovery is fueled by sailing, right, by shipbuilding. And so how in the world did these things that are no more than giant canoes, these rickety wooden ships, sail across the world, Magellan, around the world, right? Not in one fell swoop, I get it. But how did they do it? And so look at this. You go, first voyage of Columbus. If you follow the path down to the Canaries, across here, oh, I'm in India, right? Nope. In and around, and then back. Why didn't he just do this? Just sail straight away. This adds a lot of time and distance to the journey. Why not a green line? Well, part of it is because there's prevailing winds. And this has been known for a while. So to go west, I have to go south, pick up the prevailing westerlies and come across. And then when it's time to go back home, to go east, I have to go north and then pick up the prevailing. And they call this area in between the doldrums, where there's not much going on. Right? And this part's called the intertropical convergence zone. This is where a lot of big thunderstorms and things happen. A lot of hurricanes develop in this area. So, okay, I get that. I got to go south to go west. But how do I do that? And here's a picture of the Santa Maria. Again, a big giant canoe with a sail on it. What's the deal with this guy in the little boat? There's always some weird dude in a little boat. You'll see it again later in history, too. That ship is the key to how this all worked. But it's never really explained very well. At least I don't think so. So think about ships, right? The old classic Roman warship or Greek warship. You've got the big square sail. Yep. And then when the wind's not blowing, you got these poor dudes in the bottom rowing. But here's the thing. This sail is great when the wind's coming from behind me, blowing into it. What if it's coming this way, but I want to go the other way? Well, I'm kind of stuck. I can bring the sail down. I can have people start rowing, but I'm rowing against the wind and maybe the tide. You're not going to make a lot of headway. So here's the thing. This is an Arab invention. It's called the lateen. It's a triangular sail. And if you've ever sailed, you're familiar with it. But the thing that the lateen sail does is it allows you to tack. So I can actually go in the direction the wind is coming from by going this way and this way. Really what it is kind of an airplane wing. It generates low pressure on this side, and so it's kind of pulling you, just like a wing pulls you up into the air. So that's how it works. So now what do? Well, I combine the lateen with the square, and now when the wind's behind me, I can haul butt. But if it's not, I can take down the square sails, use the lateen sails, and keep moving, no matter what the wind's doing. So that's another piece to fueling the age of discovery. And look at these things. Can you imagine sailing across the ocean in that? Yeehaw. One more piece. Where the heck are we, Columbus? How do we know where we are sailing across the Atlantic Ocean? There's no GPS. It has to do with time, angularity, distance, some weird things. Yeah, and I'm a geek, but maybe you find this interesting. There's a thing called dead reckoning. How do I do it? Put my head in the way all the time. Time times speed equals distance. Okay, what do you mean? For 2 hours at 60 miles an hour, I've covered 120 miles. Okay, great. But that doesn't really help a lot. I need one more piece of information. What's missing from this? Where are you going? So now add north. 2 hours, 60 miles an hour, head north. I went 120 miles north. Good. That helps. And how can I figure out how fast I'm going in a boat in that era? What they did, you've heard the term knots. I'm going 60 knots. They actually use knots on a rope. Speed in knots. The question at the bottom, dead reckoning, not the best. So let's say my boat's the fastest in the world. I'm going at 60 miles an hour for 2 hours and I'm traveling north. But if I'm on the Atlantic Ocean, does that mean I went 120 miles north? What about winds? What about tide? What about the things that influence the direction I'm going in? Right? So that can influence my trip north. Maybe I'm going northeast for those 2 hours. Now I'm way off course. And that's the knot. They actually did it. They tied knots at an interval, would throw it in the water, count how many knots go through their fingers, in an amount of time, and you're going 6 knots. That's where the term comes from. There's still something missing, though. And what it is how do I tell where I am at a given time? Yeah, I traveled north, I traveled east and west, and that comes down to measuring both time and angularity. So at a certain time, I can take out my sextant and look at the sun angle, and at 12 o'clock in this area, the sun would be in that position, puts me in a single spot on the earth. Now, it's not as precise as GPS, it's a few mile radius, but it puts you in the ballpark. And so now what do I have to do? I have to transfer that to, well, the idea here is, if you do watch Master and Commander, one of the key jobs on the ship was making sure the sand dial was accurate, that you flip the clock. But the development of a winding clock was beneficial because, again, I had to have accurate time to triangulate where I am on the globe. And so that gives you this latitude and longitude. Because if I know the time and I know the angle of that star or that sun, there's only one place on Earth at that time it would be at that angle. So that puts me here. So, yo, Columbus, where are we? We're right here. That fuels the age of discovery as well. Just got to know where the sun is. Unfortunately, they didn't have maps like this. Their maps look like that. So there's still a bit of inaccuracy, but we're getting there, right? And the age of discovery pushes technology, shipbuilding, navigation, timekeeping, etc. One of the interesting outcomes. So kind of cool, huh? Little sidetrack. So next class is, again, quiz 1, sort of a misnomer in that that'll be done online, and there'll be a window of a couple days to take it. But when I actually see you guys in class again, we'll be starting to jump into Chapter 3, which begins the colonization of North America. So friction between different colonies, friction between still European powers, so much land, so much money to be made, and hardly anybody to do the work. And oh, by the way, the natives are not really digging this. So we're going to see all of those things develop as we move slowly toward revolution. All right, right in an hour with a couple sidetracks, but I hope you found the trip through Henry VIII and navigation, etc. a little bit interesting. All right, so I will see you guys Thursday, and by then we'll know, one, if the Browns or the Buckeyes won or not. And we'll be that much closer to Inauguration Day. So I'll see you then.